Now, the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We have good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today, all of it brought to you by Lending Club. Right now, you can go to lendingclub.com/martini. You can check your rate in just minutes and borrow up to $40,000. Lendingclub.com/martini. More on them a little bit later in the podcast. Jim, the Democrats were licking their chops again. They've scored a couple of upsets in special elections this year that have gotten a lot of attention, namely the Alabama Senate race, as well as the Pennsylvania House race, where Connor Lamb was able to squeak out a victory. But nonetheless, Ohio was the next spot. The Democrats were sure that they had this in their bag, even though Republicans have won it for more than 35 years. But all of their tracking polls had the Republican Troy Balderson stuck at about 46%. They were sure the momentum was with the Democrat. And in the end, it was a very tight race. In fact, it still is a very tight race. They still have to count provisionals and absentees and military ballots. But as of all the precincts closing, Troy Balderson, the Republican, is up by about 1,700 votes over the Democrat, Danny O'Connor. And so now you get all the headlines of, well, this sure shows the Republicans are in big trouble in general. And that may be true. It's going to be a difficult year. The Republicans control everything. And in a midterm election in that environment, it usually doesn't go very well for that party that's in control. But nonetheless, the Democrats, they thought in the final days that they had this thing in the bag. They don't have it in the bag. I guess with the final vote count, they still have a chance. But a win that's much closer than it should be is still better than a loss.
This is probably best thought of in terms of a good martini being a bullet dodged. I think it's safe to say that if the Democrats had won this race, you add this in with the Connor Lamb win, GOP donors would have, if not panicked, then said, okay, look, the House is done. No point in supporting it. Might as well put all our resources into the Senate and hope for the best. And I think that would have, these things tend to kind of generate a snowball-like momentum on their own. Now, the other thing also, which was worth noting, was the day before you started hearing Republicans saying, look, we didn't have the best candidate in this race. All the kind of excuses we've gotten used to when you're preparing for a loss, when you're looking for reasons to explain, look, don't take too many lessons from this one particular special House race. Look, the reason this is a good win for Republicans in the sense that it's better than a loss. We'll talk in a future martini about how keeping the House just got one more step a little bit complicated. But now you've got a most nominal form of an incumbent. The two candidates will have a rematch in November. I think, okay, now they know exactly that the Republican campaign can study the results. Where did we overperform? Where did we underperform? Where do we have to put more resources? And, you'd probably give the Republicans a slight edge to keep this seat in November. Having said that, look, this is a district that Trump won by 11 points. Tiberi, the old GOP incumbent, was used to winning, nearly 2-1. This is John Kasich's old seat. These are Columbus suburbs. This is not the sort of area where Republicans should be having a hard time winning. Now, you can say this is, you don't have your incumbent on the ballot. Incumbents have huge name ID advantages. They've done a lot of, ways of helping their constituents. They have a lot of advantages that you're not going to get to enjoy in an open seat race. Maybe you have some, so you can look at different reasons to say, okay, we should expect it to be closer than the usual 2-1 Tiberi margin. I ran the numbers. I looked at what the actual congressional vote was in 2016. It's a presidential year. Your good high turnout environment. This is Ohio. It's presidentially competitive. It's usually competitive statewide. The Democrats got 9 out of every 10 people who voted for their Democratic candidate in 2016. That's in the middle of August for a special election. That's a phenomenal turnout rate. Republicans, 4 out of every 10. Now, if the Democrats are bringing out 9 out of every 10, and you're bringing out 4 out of every 10, you're going to lose in a lot of circumstances. You're going to lose any district that is any less Republican-leaning than Ohio 12th, like this one. So that's where we are. As much as Republicans are breathing a little bit easier or looking and saying, oh, wow, we barely pulled that one off. We still got to worry about this recount or this, these provisional ballots and things like that. Look, could have been much, much worse this morning. I think if it had gone the other way, we'd be talking about the House being nearly done. The Republicans still have a chance, but they should have no illusions about what is a very, very challenging midterm election environment.
Yeah, two quick exit notes here. First of all, by the time this is actually decided, the winner of the special election might not actually get to do anything in Washington before the November election when these two go at it again, like you mentioned, because they're going to count the absentees and the provisional ballots. That's going to get certified, I think, on August 24th. And if there's any recount, that could go more weeks. And then you're into September and you're basically into fall campaign season. So you might get sworn in and maybe you get to vote on a funding bill. So congratulations. The other guy in this race, it's a 1,700 vote margin. There's an 1,127 vote tally for the Green Party candidate, Joe Manchin. You think, oh, okay, third party candidate, no big deal. This guy believes his ancestors were born on a different planet, and he speaks 19 languages, including sheet music, Jim. So what does it say about the major party candidates when that guy gets 1,100 votes?
You know, Greg, it means that a lot more people are bilingual than they thought.
Man, there is definitely a serious deficit when you're voting for a candidate like that, but it doesn't mean that has to translate to your personal debt. For decades, credit cards have been telling us buy it now and pay for it later with interest. Despite your best intentions, that interest can get out of control fast.
With Lending Club, you can consolidate your debt or pay off credit cards with one fixed monthly payment. Since 2007, Lending Club has helped millions of people regain control of their finances with affordable fixed-rate personal loans. No more trips to the bank, no more high-interest credit cards. Just go to lendingclub.com, tell them about yourself and how much you want to borrow, pick the terms that are right for you, and if you're approved, your loan is automatically deposited into your bank account in as little as just a few days. Lending Club is the #1 peer-to-peer lending platform with more than $35 billion in loans issued.
So go to lendingclub.com/martini. You can check your rate in minutes and borrow up to $40,000. That's lendingclub.com/martini. Lendingclub.com/martini. All loans made by WebBank, member FDIC, equal housing lender. All right, Jim, let's move on to our bad martini now. And it was 12 years ago that the Republicans last lost control of the House. And when that happened, you had an unpopular president. You had some issues that people were not enjoying very much, like the Iraq War, the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And you also had people who were charged and eventually convicted of financial problems. Sound familiar? Well, you might be thinking, well, who's the guy with the financial problems? Oh, here we go. News today. Politico. Congressman Chris Collins of New York was indicted Wednesday by federal prosecutors and charged with wrongdoing connected to an alleged insider trading scheme linked to his investments in an Australian biotech firm. Collins, a third-term congressman who represents a district in western New York, was the first member of Congress to back President Trump's candidacy during the 2016 election. He had been under scrutiny from the Office of Congressional Ethics for his connection to the biotech company Innate Immunotherapeutics. He's been charged, along with his son, with securities fraud, wire fraud, and making false statements to the FBI. He says he's innocent. He's going to fight it in court. Essentially, he was on the board of this place. Some of their clinical trials didn't work out. He let that information be known to his son, who then dumped some stock before the public found out, and that's what's known as insider trading. So, Jim, this stinks for a number of reasons. It paints another big bullseye on the Republican Party, could dispirit some folks. And, oh, by the way, New York's already had their congressional primaries, so what do we do with this guy?
You know, as Jazz Shaw, who lives in the area, is writing in Hot Air, and he says, look, it's not clear they can replace him on the ballot. It doesn't look like he wants to. He's insisting he's innocent, and he's going to fight the charges. This sure as heck gives the Democratic challenger a nice, big, easy talking point. Greg, anytime you're running on, my opponent has been indicted. That's kind of the wind at your back. And yes, we should emphasize, you know, a prosecutor can indict a ham sandwich. Not every indictment automatically means that it's that somebody's guilty of this. Way back in my wire service days, Greg, I remember, you know, the day the congressional financial disclosure forms would come out. Sometimes you would find something intriguing, like he had a lot of donations from the CEO of a company that he had invested in or something like that. Not every single one of these represented, you know, genuine corruption, insider trading, getting some sort of inside scoop from somebody on some development with the company right before the stock went up or the stock went down. But it is fair to kind of look at this suspiciously. I'm not sure that every single elected official needs to have all of their personal finances in a blind trust, but there's a reason people get this perception of members of Congress and politicians in general being corrupt and on the take and always looking for ways to profit from their offices and stuff like that. look, we will see. I suppose it's possible this case could fall apart in the courtroom, but my guess is this is a U.S. Attorney's Office that has a pretty good record in this sort of thing, and they wouldn't come after a member of Congress unless they felt like they had a pretty solid case. So, look, we talked about the good news in Ohio's special election, but now we have another House race in New York that was already going to be not easy to keep. Obviously, it's not going to be a great statewide, gubernatorial campaign or anything like that. New York is challenging in the best of circumstances. And now we have a Republican congressman who's under indictment and has to hope that the voters decide there's not much to these charges. My suspicion is, considering all of his ties to the both his ties, his son's ties, his daughter-in-law's father's ties, this is just all going to be a very, very challenging environment, and one more House race that looks like it's probably going to be lost for the Republicans.
Which would be a major shame, not necessarily because Collins is great. I don't know his record in and out, but he did win 2-1 in 2016. So for the Democrats to pick up a seat that ought to be leaning that far in favor of the Republicans would definitely be a blow. And it's not just that seat, because remember when it was Bob Ney and Duke Cunningham, you had Nancy Pelosi out there crowing about a culture of corruption inside the Republican Party, and now she's got ammo to do it again. All right, Jim, let's move on to the crazy martini now and go and wait in the Wayback Machine for some folks here. This is courtesy of the local NBC affiliate here in Washington. John Hinckley, the would-be assassin who shot and wounded President Ronald Reagan, has asked for his unconditional release, according to a new court filing from the United States Attorney's Office for D.C. A hearing on the matter is scheduled for mid-December in Washington. Hinckley was transferred from a mental hospital in 2016, where he'd served a 35-year commitment to serve time and convalescent leave at his mother's home in Williamsburg, Virginia. The leave requires Hinckley regularly to report to court officials about his treatment and support. The court records reviewed by News 4 show Hinckley made a motion for unconditional release from his commitment in an April 30th hearing before a D.C. judge. The filing from prosecutors said Hinckley cited a code in D.C. law allowing people to seek release or changes in the conditions of their custody. And Hinckley, of course, shot President Reagan in March of 1981. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and so has been in that system ever since. Now he says he's fine, or at least fine enough to not need any more supervision of any kind here. Jim, you've expressed some very strong opinions on Twitter on this. This really has your gears grinding.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, the Pope hat, who is otherwise a very enjoyable and bright civil libertarian defense lawyer who weighs on these things, has told me I am wrong every possible way on this and twice on Sundays. Look, I just kind of marvel at the fact that this guy shot 4 people. Never mind the assassination of the president. He left James Brady paralyzed, shot a cop, shot a Secret Service agent. And he's at some point, for certain periods of time now, he walks around as a free man, and he's quite possibly going to walk the streets free in the not too distant future. I just kind of find this baffling. People say, look, this comes down to him being found not guilty by reason of insanity back in the trial in the 80s. And the idea that, well, he wasn't really responsible for what he did. He couldn't possibly understand the consequences of his actions and all of that. I actually looked it up after the debate I had this morning, Greg. Squeaky Fromme is a free woman. She has, apparently living quietly in New York. I guess if you do keep people behind bars for long periods of time, they don't automatically then return to their habits of assassination. I just kind of marvel. We always had this philosophy in life that if you shoot at a president, there was some pretty darn serious consequences. Could John Wilkes Booth have managed to plead insanity? If Lee Harvey Oswald had not been shot by Jack Ruby, would he have been able to plead insanity? It's kind of fascinating that this is, the idea that in our lifetime, I think probably it's one of my first memories of larger events, and I probably was about 6 years old at the time. The idea that somebody could do that, and then the system would look at them and say, no, this person is not a threat. That's fine. Somebody else also raised the very interesting point that traditionally, before someone gets released, we all remember the Hinckley's claim that he was doing it to impress Jodie Foster. And of course, everyone's like, oh my goodness, he'd seen her in a movie. Clearly, this guy was off his rocker. This is one more reason to find him insane. I don't know. Any reason to think that should Jodie Foster be given an opportunity to weigh in on this? Does he represent some threat to her? Apparently, the doctors believe he is not. Some people may find that easier to believe than others. And the other kind of one other interesting wrinkle to this that I was struck by and didn't, it kind of escaped my attention when it actually had occurred. James Brady, the president's secretary, was among those who were shot, and probably, the one who was most seriously injured, although obviously he came, very close to killing Reagan. James Brady's death back in, this was 2014, was ruled a homicide. They said that the death came because of the result from the gunshot wound. Obviously, he had lived paralyzed for 33 years. Now, they've ultimately decided there was not likely to try Hinckley again. There was no way. They're basically too close to coming to double jeopardy. The U.S. Attorney's Office reviewed it all and basically came to the conclusion it was going to face insurmountable legal barriers. But in the end, Hinckley still did it, right? There's no dispute. There's no disagreement about that. Just gobsmacking that you can do something that has such a terrible effect on so many people's lives. And then, to some people's lives, 33 years, that's 30. I guess we're now up to 34, 35 years. I guess they believe that's enough of a sentence. That's enough of a punishment. You can walk the streets a free man. I don't know, my gut, that strikes me as very wrong. I know the lawyers on Twitter are telling me how wrong I am. And apparently I am now the greatest threat to civil liberties that exists in the country right now. I don't know. It just kind of strikes me as baffling. Permit me my chance to vent. Yes, I realize that's what the judge ruled. That's what the jury ruled. No, I'm not saying that my feelings are a substitute for the law. But by golly, I think I'm allowed to just vent about this and say, how many people do you have to shoot before we keep you in jail for the rest of your life? 4 seems like a lot, right? I said I was self-aware enough to realize that your perspective of somebody who commits a crime and your perspective of mercy and leniency probably relates a great deal to could you see yourself or one of your loved ones committing a particular crime? I think that's one of the reasons that obviously, there's such a push for marijuana legalization. People who've done it themselves and realized that technically they were breaking the law, even though the law was very unevenly enforced and in some contexts, really not enforced at all. Well, if I could, by golly, nobody else should be going to jail for that too. By golly, somebody got into a drunken bar fight. Look, lots of people have had too much. Lots of people have had their tempers flare. Maybe you shouldn't go to jail for a long period of time for something like that. Presidential assassination is not something you stumble into. It's not something that, I had a really bad day at the office and that's how I ended up, shooting those 4 people or something like that. And it just seems like there should be, I think, the most serious consequences you can get there. Now, people said, look, Hinckley was crazy. These are sufficient consequences. He's not a threat to anybody. I guess we'll see, Greg, and maybe he isn't, but I just kind of find it marvel that you could be a would-be presidential assassin can walk the streets a free man in 2018 America.
Yeah, and for any of our younger listeners who might not have gotten the Squeaky Fromm reference, she was a Manson family member who tried to kill President Ford in 1975, actually tried to escape prison in the 80s to meet up with Manson again, who I'm pretty sure was behind bars already at that point, but somehow she got paroled back in 2008, eventually released in 2009. So that might be another person who we should be scratching our head about. Nothing but the best, Jim. Nothing but the best.
Nothing but the best. There we go. Look at the bright side, Greg. It's Friday.
Oh, no. Not for a couple more days, but we can dream. Jim, talk to you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. And be sure to visit our friends over at lendingclub.com/martini. Check your rated minutes. Borrow up to $40,000. lendingclub.com/martini. And tune in again on Thursday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.